The Vikings traveled to Africa 2,000 years ago, and we're not referring to Egypt or Syria. No, 3 separate graves of women of Sub Saharan African descent have been found in ancient Viking settlements scattered across Europe. To put that into perspective, the Ottomans were the first to capture and trade African slaves, and they only got to Sub-Saharan Africa 1,300 years after the carbon dating on the oldest set of remains in the Viking villages were dated to. Recordings in Scandinavian runes confirm that 2 brothers fought along the coasts of Morocco and Mauritania, maybe even farther south to what is Sierra Leone today. Back then, maps of the west coast of Africa were non-existent, yet the longboats were riding and raiding along those waters 1,000 years before the rest even knew there was land to conquer at all. The Visby Lenses discovery has perplexed mainstream archaeology since they were dug up in 1999 at a Viking gravesite in Gotland, Sweden. To put it simply, the technology to make the spherical lenses was around at the time, but their very specific shape indicated that they were used as optic lenses, a technology that wouldn't exist for another few hundred years. Around the size of a large marble, the quartz was polished to a smooth finish with more precision than anything else available at the time. But the Visby lenses had a flat bottom and a biospheric surface. For our listeners out there who have ever worn a pair of glasses, you'll know that this curved surface would be ideal to use as a viewing instrument for reading and to observe minuscule things in greater detail. Most of the Visby lenses were mounted on silver hondings, meant to be worn around the neck, almost like a necklace. As you can imagine, the mainstream theory is that the lenses were just shiny pieces of jewelry, since they were obviously meant to be worn around the neck, or that they were used to start fires and burn wounds clean by concentrating the rays of the sun. The argument that they date to the 11th century lies in the silver that they were encased in, but chances are that those embellishments were added much later. Dating quartz is impossible after all. The silver shows the usual wear and tear for a single user, or maybe even another descendant's use before the burial, but the lenses themselves show a lot more scuff marks, indicating that they were used for centuries before they were buried, probably long enough to cause their casings to wear out, necessitating them to be replaced by the silver holdings that they were later found in. But the alternative space believes otherwise. Carrying the lens around the neck on a necklace would actually have been a very practical way to have it close at hand if the wearer ever needed to view something up close, or if an aging individual's eyes weren't focusing as they should. Well, they wouldn't have to store it away from their bodies, where it would be inconvenient to reach. What takes this out of the realm of unusual to downright bizarre is that they were found encased in weapons and other tools for war. Some of them were so accurately calibrated that they weren't appropriate for reading at all, but were instead ideal for looking across vast distances on land and sea. To put that into perspective, the first telescope was produced in the early 1600s, 500 years after the silver on the Visby lenses were dated to have been manufactured. Isaac Newton later stole that patent, but that's a video for another day. So even if they were made at the time that the silver was forged, they still predate the telescope by half a century. When the rockstone was found embedded in a church wall in Sweden in the 19th century, its existence wasn't all that surprising. The Nordic nations had a habit of cleverly hiding their religious and cultural artifacts and records in plain sight. This was a genius move. Instead of meeting the Christian church in open conflict and risk losing their precious history forever, they decided to play along on the surface while they preserved their treasures in the very churches that the Christians made them build in the first place. What makes the stone unusual is its size and what was written on it. The thing weighs 2 tons and was probably made somewhere around the 9th century, making it a very challenging piece of architecture to produce and to manage to move around at the time. The date of its construction is still hotly debated, but nevertheless, even if it was produced in the 9th century, the Scandinavians were not supposed to have the capabilities to create ciphers and codes back then. Some of the text was translated, and from what little that we can decipher now, it tells mythological tales of the gods, mentions mythical creatures, poetry, and prophecies of natural disasters that are still to come. But the incredible amount of thought put into creating complex ciphers means that this obviously wasn't meant to be read by just anyone. It's highly likely that what little we can read is mostly obscured by innuendo and anagrams to further hide the real message. And even if someone does manage to decipher the whole thing, chances are we'll never know what the hidden meanings are behind the jumbled mess of unrelated segments between subjects that seemingly don't relate to each other at all. One thing's certain, It's unlikely that anyone would have gone through all that trouble just to carve out coded snippets of random poetry and myths that don't even relate to one another. If they wanted to record the history of a single god or a moment in time, then they would have done so from start to finish. Something was written there, not meant to be understood by any of us. The Ulfberht swords of the Vikings were probably the most feared weapon of their time. Capable of slicing through bone and other iron weapons like butter, there was nothing to compare it to back then, or even now. What made these swords so incredibly strong and precise is the fact that they were made with technology that we did not possess until the Industrial Revolution. To get iron ore as pure as the Ulfberht swords, they needed to be heated to at least 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The composition of the finished product and the lack of impurities weren't replicated until the gigantic furnaces necessary for creating that amount of heat were constructed in 1890, 1,000 years after Vikings mastered the technology. We know what the process required, but not how on earth they managed to harness the colossal temperatures needed to do it. There are no records of how to make it, no archaeological evidence, and the only thing even close to a furnace that's ever been found at Viking smithies are only appropriate to manufacture the kind of weapons that everyone from the east to the west was using at the time. Unsurprisingly, the secret to making the swords that were capable of striking fear into even the most formidable enemy was heavily guarded. So much so that instead of putting down some form of permanent record of making it, it was allowed to die out before the Ottomans and the Christians could get their hands on the Scandinavians' most deadly weapon. The word Ulfberht was inscribed on every original sword. Given that the inscriptions were all in ancient runic script and that they all bore the same style and method of writing, it means that they were probably produced in a single place, maybe even just by a single line of smithies that passed the knowledge down from generation to generation. Ulf means wolf, and the god Loki's son was a gigantic wolf named Fenrir. The name Fenrir translates to punisher or penalty giver, so the name was most likely chosen not after the individual who perfected the craft, but as a nod to the feared wolf who exacts revenge in the legends of the gods. And finally, we arrive at the most well-known theory that Vikings discovered America long before anyone else did. Scholars have been trying to dispute the discovery of the Americas by the Scandinavians ever since Columbus first claimed the land in 1492. To them, the tales dating back more than 500 years before Columbus landed were just fairy tales, in the same vein as Atlantis. But when a Viking settlement was unearthed in Newfoundland, Canada, that dated back 1,000 years, they could no longer deny that the Norsemen made the journey first. According to them, a banished murderer by the name of Leif Erikson was the one to settle in Canada after he was banished for committing murder. He took his family on a longboat and set out to find new land, since he wasn't allowed to return to his homeland. Leif came upon Greenland, where a settlement quickly sprung up. From Greenland, it didn't take long for routes between Iceland and Greenland to take place. One such visitor was Bjarni Herjolfsson. In the year 936, he was blown off course, and he and his crew saw the coast of Canada. Bjarni never explored the land, but he saw enough of it to name it Vinland because of the wild grapes that grew on the forested shores. He turned his ship around and finally found Greenland again, spreading the news of the seemingly empty and fertile land that he saw. It wasn't until 15 years later that Leif tracked Bjarni down, got a vague description of where Vinland was, and set out to find it. And that's exactly what Leif did. He landed on Baffin Island, Canada, and set up the first European settlement in the Americas. Now, according to scholars, the Vikings who landed there simply got lucky, and they only managed to get the news back to Greenland. It's assumed that they died in Canada or were absorbed by the natives, essentially wiping them off the map and halting any further explorations. Surely they never reached beyond Canada, because if they did make it back home, then they'd have sent numerous expeditions to explore the new land. They proposed that when Columbus reached the Americas, the Vikings were long gone, and their footprint was so insignificant that it did not validate the Scandinavian claim to the land. Never mind the numerous mentions of Vinland in Scandinavian texts and oral traditions long before Leif and Bjarni existed. How did records of Vinland reach Europe if none of the Vikings ever made it back then? And if they only reached Canada, then why was there a Norse coin found all the way down in Maine? The coin is definitely authentic, that no one can deny. It dates back to the reign of King Olaf Kyrre 1,000 years ago. So far, the evidence definitively suggests that the Vikings reached the US 1,000 years ago. But this wasn't the first mention of a place called Vinland. The name Vinland existed another 1,000 years before that already. Bjarni knew of the stories, like any sea captain would, and he rightfully assumed that the place he found was that very Vinland that his forefathers had passed down. And yes, there is plenty of evidence to suggest that the Nords landed on US soil 2,000 years ago, like their lore implies. The US is littered with runic inscriptions that have no business being found so far inland. So far, 8 separate stones have been found across the United States, the oldest of which was dated to be more than 2,000 years old. The Heavener runestone, the Kensington stone, the runestones in Poteau and Shawnee, and these are just the ones that passers-by happen to stumble upon. Who knows what else is out there? Experts are quick to call them all hoaxes, but they've yet to bring forth any evidence to dispute the original findings, and once the Smithsonian Museum gets their hands on one of these artifacts, well, then you can count on never seeing it again. Then there's the very ancient Native American lore that speaks of red-headed giants that slaughtered and even ate people. Tales of light-skinned wild men are almost too many to count, and they aren't just localized to the USA. There are histories passed down all the way through South America too. From the north to the south, the oral traditions of the native populations have been so accurate that they even accurately describe the Younger Dryas event that happened 11,000 years ago. There is no reason to doubt oral history when it comes to the ancient peoples of the Americas. Whether the light-skinned, red-headed men were cannibals is hard to say, but one thing is certain: they were there long enough to leave traces of themselves all the way in Oklahoma. Maybe even farther, depending on what the Smithsonian managed to get their hands on before news of it reached the light of day. Every time a discovery is made, half of it disappears, leaving us with only shards and crumbs to piece together, while the whole truth is hidden away in the shadows. But why? Why hide the fact that there used to be knowledge in the past, or like in this case, that someone else might have made it across the world before Columbus? And that's why Ancient Secrets is here, to open the conversation, to lift the veil of a world that is intentionally hidden from us. Tell us in the comments below, why do you think it's so important to obscure what really happened in the past? And before you leave, you know the drill. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Your engagement is what keeps the lights on over here, so our team can bring you all the strange and unexplainable secrets just waiting for you to discover them.